Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the next installment of Interview with an Exorcist. My name is John Barnwell. I'm here in the greater metropolitan Detroit area, as is my special friend, my greatest teacher, and most gifted pupil, Dr. Douglas Gabriel. And we're going to continue on in the remarkable saga that at the time we really weren't aware of the significance of some of the things that we had done together. Douglas, how are you?
I'm very good, John. One another day above ground is a good day for me. So, yes, and all this reverie, all this thinking back at the end of our shows, we just go, well, we forgot these people and, ring off a list of people. So, but I've been thinking about, how to make this interesting for the subscribers, the listeners. And again, I'm going to make the statement that Detroit was, somebody called it, a lot of cool remarks have come in also. Somebody called it the Vienna of America. They called it the Paris of America, and other such remarks, because really, Detroit is the center of a lot of stuff.
Well, what they used to call it back then, back in the 60s, it was nicknamed the Paris of the Midwest.
Yes, and so we just about, I get all wound up with the stories about these individuals because they were such significant teachers to me. And what's critical here to understand in terms of the biography of an exorcist, who I don't recommend you using the path that I've used, first off. Second off, if it can be of some spiritual help to people to see somebody's spiritual biography, then I'm glad to share. And that's what we did in anthroposophy. One of the first things is we gave people a year to study all kinds of things, to unlearn what they had learned. And we call it the orientation year. The student called it the oh, why? Oh, why did I come to Detroit? Oh, why did I decide to study Rudolf Steiner? Oh, why did I choose the most difficult spiritual path, anthroposophy? Oh, why? Why? And they may or may not have gotten answers. But but the cool thing was that the most amazing people I ever met all were drawn to this program, and, there'd be about 35 students in the OY, the orientation year, and 35 in the teacher training, and maybe 20 in the early childhood. Then they got special education, and then they got agriculture, and then they got social development. And so for all the years that they were in Detroit, what people don't understand is what I'm about to tell you. Recently, I produced by extracting it from the ancients and from the best, and then made up the rest, a book on the heart, the human heart. John probably knows where I'm going to go immediately with this, right? So the human heart is, Rudolf Steiner says, if you take the human heart and you turn it inside out, you have the universe. And if you take the universe and you turn it outside in, you have the human heart. And Rudolf Steiner once said that Waldorf education would not be able to grow beyond small islands of culture that could reach out into their local regional community with a spiritual effect until the hindrance was removed from science that believed that the heart was a pump. In other words, mechanical, machine intelligence, all this stuff that we're into is all determined because they use the body, the temple of the human being, which is an image of God, as some kind of a chance for an analogy for a machine. The brain is the central processing unit. It's the CPU. The heart is a pump. That this is that. No, no, none of that's right. And if you demean the human being into being a machine, then you lose the entire import of Waldorf education. And Waldorf education, of course, we'll go into that later when we get there, because now I'm just introducing you to the community that I ran into like a meteorite. I landed in the area, and as often was the case, they put me in charge of everything. They didn't know who I was, so they put me in charge of housing. They put me in charge of the bookstore. They put me in charge of this and that. And so I really got to know the people. And because my mm, insatiable desire for knowledge, which I could someday hopefully turn into wisdom, but my insatiable desire for knowledge, the quest, never ended. So I was always questing everywhere all the time, going at a very, very quick speed. So I'd like to preface this show with that statement, and that Detroit now, well, now is a different time. Now localities no longer mean what they used to mean. The Mayflower Bookshop, as we've referred to last time, it was the center of people getting the knowledge that they needed on their quest for wisdom, and it served. I don't know. I'd probably be exaggerating if I said whatever number, but it served. Certainly, I'd say tens of thousands of people, and especially while you was there as the manager and the caretaker of the rare books and the rare book catalog, and you were doing readings. And then all of these readers and all these cool spiritual people would come in and out, flying like bees to the beehive. And last time, John ended up saying, well, we have to talk about Janet McGavin and Eve Hardy and next time. And that would be good, because both of them had a lot to do with my spiritual development, because both of them were clairvoyant. And we'll chat about them in a second. But I wanted to mention the human heart. The heart of Detroit, and I don't know if John will agree with me on this, was Ralph Marinelli. Ralph Marinelli is the person who at United Methodist in downtown Detroit started the first kindergarten, Waldorf-inspired kindergarten in Detroit on his own. And he then ran into Rudy Wilhelm, a German doctor, who he and his wife gave the money to start the Detroit Waldorf School. And it was Ralph who solicited Werner Glass and Barbara, his wife, to come to Detroit. And it was Ralph who solicited Theo Bergen and Mariana Bergen to come to be the lead teachers of the school. And in the end, the Wilhelms, who had a child that they wanted to go to the Waldorf School, they didn't get to send her because they didn't have the grades that high up. Usually a Waldorf school starts with the kindergarten, first grade, something like that, and then grows each year. So the Wilhelms were devoted to the Waldorf School, but it was Ralph Marinelli, the unsung hero, who was on the board of the Waldorf Institute and the Waldorf School. And he was an Army engineer in charge of a big laboratory where he said, I would tell my guys I was working with that if they didn't blow up something at least once a week, I knew they weren't working hard enough. And that is Ralph. He Italian guy. He's the heart of gold. He absolutely was hysterically funny to me. And I wanted to bring him up because one of the most significant tasks that Rudolf Steiner gave for the modern age was to prove that the heart is not a pump. And so I, as a clairvoyant, I had modeled what the heart looked like to me, and I could see the wings on the heart, and I could see the sac around the heart, and I could see these things, and I modeled it into amber and other substances. And so I was always working with that because kind of all Rosicrucians, I should say, are healers, but they're supposed to heal for free. So that was one of my assigned tasks that I assigned myself. So when I was a Waldorf teacher at the Detroit Waldorf School, well, Ralph and I had already become great friends. They needed someone to step in for a seventh grade and finish seventh and eighth grade. So I became his mentor teacher, and he had never taught before. And he taught the seventh and eighth grade, which was one of the most amazing things I ever witnessed. He did things with that class that no human being could have ever even imagined. In the hallway, he put up, who was it that painted the Sistine Chapel? Michelangelo, right? Yeah, he built the scaffolding, the freestanding scaffolding in the middle of our hallway, so that the students could lay on their back and paint the cosmic sky with the current comets that were coming through the sky, because we had a number of them at that time, and all the starry script, and leave all kinds of special messages up there for the future. That's what he did one year. Another year, he built a fountain, so that the Romans loved fountains, and so he had his class build fountains. So he was a doer. And somehow he did make it through the seventh and eighth grade. And then at the end of it, I came to love him so much I couldn't stand not to work with him anymore. So I assigned him the task. I would come up to him and say, you see this X on your arm? My brothers and I used to play this game. That X means you're going to get punched there because you did something wrong. And so now I'm going to punch you. And I punched him in the arm. And he goes, whoa, that hurt. What are you doing punching me? He wasn't upset, really. He was just wondering. I'm like, I'm going to do that every time I see you until you prove that the heart is not a pump. Because that's what's hindering me from helping the Waldorf schools expand. Rudolf Steiner made that prophecy. So you need to figure out why the heart is not a pump and prove it to the medical world. Okay, Ralph? And he's like, he looked at me like I was insane. And then, John, you can complete the story.
Well, yeah, that's quite an episode. I remember, see, Ralph would come by the bookstore and take me out to lunch when he'd come up with some perplexing issue, and he he'd think, oh, I'll go talk to John, see what he thinks. So he comes to me one time, and he had this invention that he did where he put a strip of metal with little holes in it on a dipstick for a car, because if you have too much oil, it like splashes around and makes the engine less efficient. And he wanted to go show that to Henry Ford II. And he asked me, because he knew that I knew quite a few people that knew Henry Ford II and whatnot. But anyways, so I said, well, just go down to headquarters and stand in the hall. When he comes by, ask him if he wants to hear a joke. Because Ralph was always telling jokes. He was one of the funniest people. So lighthearted is a good way to put it. And so he did that. And he comes back like the following week. He said, well, I did what you said. I said, what did I say? He said, oh, you told me to go down to Ford headquarters and stand in the hallway and wait for Henry Ford II to walk by and then ask him if he wants to hear a joke. I said, oh, yeah, I remember that. He says, well, it worked. He said, come on, follow me. And he went into Henry Ford's office, and Henry Ford shut the door, and they sat down, and he got to have private time with one of the busiest people on the planet. And so that's kind of Ralph. He was a G5, which is like being, I guess, a colonel in the Army, and he was head of the tank command here in Detroit where they made the tanks. And one day he comes by and he explains to me that he had this discussion with you, Douglas, about the heart is not a pump. And he went down to the butcher's and he bought a beef heart and he cut into it and he opened it up and he noticed that the very bottom of the heart, what's called the apex, it's not like it's drawn in Gray's Anatomy, because there they section it at the wrong spot, so it looks like it's very thick on the bottom. It's merely a hinge. So there's this thin, like couple layers of skin basically at the bottom of the heart. And so he said, that was it. That's all I had to do to figure it out, because it's impossible that something that thin would be able to withstand any kind of pumping action. And then the story continues on from there, but we ended up creating a research paper. I was his assistant, and we worked on it for several years, and he brought in his son, who's pulmonary specialist, and numerous medical people. Of course, I didn't have a diploma in any of those areas. I would just take what he would write, and then I'd make it more clear. And he loved it. He said, you write clearer than these doctor guys with all these letters after their name. I said, well, I just take my time, it's just, I think they could probably do it too, But in any event, our mission was to prove what the heart wasn't. We didn't want to venture too far into radical assumption regarding what the heart is, as far as its dynamic motion activity. But as a result of analyzing the heart using all the various technologies that have become available since Rudolf Steiner's time, we were able to observe Doppler studies and eventually, we saw that the heart has a rotational movement. And so Ralph got a Perrier bottle and he hooked a hose off the vacuum cleaner on it, and he would put water in it, and he comes over before he put the hose on. He just had the bottle, and he had a bunch of water in it. He goes, "John, come out of here." So I come out in the parking lot of the store. He goes, "Look at this," and he rotated it like this and ejected all the water out of the thing in a very dynamic vortex that went very far. He said, "That's what's going on. The heart's ejecting vortexes of blood." And so we ended up discovering an important component of what the heart is, but very hesitant to over describe, because that's what material science tends to do. They get certain technical data and then they extrapolate from there. And because of that, the material focus, there are certain components that are not included in the equation. Like when they leave the sun out of the equation for weather, that kind of thing. You're on mute.
Yeah. We'll look at those statistics later concerning the sun and climate. Nah, nothing we should look at. But yes, so basically, Branko first was one of the people that worked with you guys. And in the end, you wrote a document that was then accepted by the scientific community, demonstrating that the heart was perhaps a vortex momentum booster, but it certainly was not a pump. And then the spiraling motion of blood in the veins came to be well known. And Branko first, a cardiologist who I've met a number of times, but after we met him at a conference where we spoke about these things at length. And basically, Ralph isn't given any credit for it. You weren't given any credit for it. And even his son, who was signed the original scientific study, was given hardly any credit for it. But now Branko first is, and he has 2 books out. They are now literally textbooks used in medical school, and they demonstrate that not only what John and Ralph had proved was true, but also that capillary dynamics causes blood to be literally sucked out to your periphery, and then it turns in these, when it goes down to one single blood cell, and then it turns from red blood to blue blood, turns around and comes back, it's actually sucked back. And so it's not a pump. It's the opposite of a pump.
Yeah, we had gotten to that point of it's what they call in medicine peripheral demand. And you have a vascular system that if we're put end to end could, I guess, circle the globe 3 times, something like that. But you have just so many small capillaries and all of that when you start to figure in the effect of being able to pump the blood strong enough to get it to pass through that hyper network, I guess you could call it, the blood vessels, is just ludicrous to even think about it. We would bring in like physics mathematicians to work out dynamics, and we were coming up with some incredible velocities of the blood within the chambers of the heart. Just from taking the Doppler sound signature and analyzing the frequencies, you can calculate the speed, the rotational velocity of the blood, and we noticed that there were separate dynamic streams going at different rates, and you have 7 different layers of musculature in the heart. And Rudolf Steiner, by the way, also said that the muscles in the heart were like your voluntary muscles. He said that pointed towards their future task when the heart becomes a voluntary organ, which is like, that's pretty wild stuff. But, medicine, they do know that that's the kind of muscles that are in the heart, but they don't tend to try and figure out, well, why is that? So there's a lot of features, but it really goes back to Aristotle when he was observing the embryo from a chicken, and he noticed that there was a pulsating drop of blood. That's the first thing that happened. And then it began to flow. And of course, we know from embryology that the blood stream begins to flow and then it ensheaths itself in the blood vessel. So the bloodstream creates the vascular system. I mean, it's just the wildest thing that you can imagine.
It's the opposite of what people think. I've recently done a show on it and a paper on it. And of course, I've written a book on it called The Heart as a Supersensible Organ of Perception. And recently I've been hammering on this because you can't have a more critical issue. Now, Steiner said that Waldorf schools couldn't expand if people still believed that the heart was a pump. After this document got out and it got out into the world, and there were actually, I think, 2 documents, and then Branko first took over, and he's got many, many articles. And he's basically known as the father of this, and 2 books, as I said, textbooks. But basically, it's the key to everything. But what happened? Did Waldorf schools go from a small number to a large number quickly after that? Yes, they did. There's now, I think, 400 Waldorf schools in America, 700 throughout the world, or now 8 or 9, who knows? It's been a while since I've been involved in it. But essentially, yes, once we removed that obstacle. And where did the obstacle get removed? Right here in the Detroit area, in Ralph's basement. And I used to attend the groups now and then when I could, but I was very busy. But essentially, one time he says, okay, we've created an amazing discovery. Look, the speed of the heart and the flow of the blood using Doppler sensing devices. So he says, you have to come down and see this, Douglas. You have to come down. So I went down and I'm looking at Doppler on the live heart, a film of it. And I say, oh, isn't that interesting? I never knew there were 3 beats in the heart. And they go, what are you talking about? I said, there's 3 beats, swish, swish, swish. Can't you hear them? And they're going, no, that's impossible. I said, yeah, I think I think just turn your thing around a little bit over here. Okay, there you go. Now, can you hear it? I can hear it clean as a bell. What's going on? Why can't you hear it? And these are all cardiologists standing around. For the first time, they heard a 3rd vortex in the heart, and now they found the 4th because it's in the atrium. And so I pointed out to them, these are vortices, folks. The reason they're going swish is because they're speeding up going into a vortex. Now science, because of these kind of discoveries and because Ralph and John put the world onto this, because those other doctors only came in after they had done the research, by the way. There are 4 vortices in the heart, and those vortices have a specific frequency. And so there aren't 4 beats to the heart. There's 4 vortices to the heart. And if your vortices are at the right tone, then you're healthy. If the axis of your heart is at the right axis, you're healthy. If it's not, illnesses. So as a clairvoyant, I've done this all my life. I could look at somebody and see their death if I looked, because I looked into their heart. Rudolf Steiner says there's a box of your karma in your heart, and it carries your karma from one life to the next. Sounds funny, but it's true. And you can look in and see that. And so when you look at somebody, basically, what are you looking at? The flow of their blood through the heart, which is what? A furnace. It's a forge. It is an altar that the flame is on. And you can literally look at that. It's like looking at the flame, and you go, oh, man, that the wood's going to run out. That flame's going to burn out in an hour. Or, oh, look at the way they did that so cleverly. That flame's going to go on all night long because of the way they've set it up. And you could look in the head and you'd see, of course, what we've talked about is the calcium carbonate crystals, or what Steiner called brain sand. And they believe brain sand was directly equivalent to your IQ. Well, what you see in the heart is these pink little drops are your karma. I know that sounds crazy, but the ancient Indians, from the Vedas down, everyone has said the same thing. You look in the heart, that's where it's all connected. So Ralph took up this project, not just because he was afraid of being punched in the arm by me, but because he was one of the most amazing people. And as far as I'm concerned, he was given almost 0 credit for all he did. And he was the heart of the Waldorf School, which created the Waldorf community, which created the Waldorf Institute, which then connected with the Romantic Futurists and the Mayflower and all these other spiritual groups. And then pretty soon, literally, we had an enclave of hundreds and hundreds of people, either who are anthroposophists or interested in anthroposophy, And all these people were like my fathers. Ralph was like my dad. Dr. Wilhelm was like my father. Amelia was like my mother. I was like an orphan, and these people took me in, and so when we talk about them, has everything to do with building the capacities that are necessary if you wish to fight evil, because that's what we did. Robert used to say, when you come in the Mayflower, put a hard hat on, because truth is going to be told here.
Yeah, and keep in mind when Steiner's talking about the box, the karmic box, it's he's speaking super sensibly. You're not going to
And
look
find
in
a
a
box.
microscope and find a box or something. And yeah, well, if you look at the Tibetan tankas, those elaborate tapestries and paintings that come from Tibet, and you see there's these little squares in arrayed around the perimeter, and those make reference to what are called skandhas, and according to the doctrine relative to tankas is that you can use them in your meditation, and you open them up and you go in, and that'll be a particular facet of karma. And so this is a long-standing tradition. Rudolf Steiner didn't just make this up out of whole cloth. It's something that's actual, objective, supersensible fact. And in looking at it, and it was fascinating in this basement at the Rudolf Steiner Research Center, and we managed to get a generous donation from Marjorie Fisher and Max Fisher, the famous real estate magnate, essentially, is what he was. He was fascinating. We got to have we got a dedicated episode to the conversations we used to go have over at her house. Incredible. But anyways, so we worked with this, and it ended up getting published. And now if you talk to a cardiologist, they'll act like they knew all along.
Oh, absolutely. We've known that for years. It's settled science. Oh, really? His book just came out like a week ago. You liar. And so, science refuses to look at phenomena. That's the problem. They only look in books. Now, I have to tell this story because so many people responded. First off, they want you to wear your crazy denim hat so that they can see what it looks like, that it's so ugly that I had to take it off your head, throw it on the ground, and stomp on it. And all I can say is you're going to feel frustrated out there in video land because you won't get to grab the hat, throw it on the ground, and stomp on it if you see it. And then I'll wear one of my funny hats because I was always wearing funny hats too. But essentially, Motown was the big thing. People were like, oh, Motown, holy cow, Motown, Motown. I said, yeah, here's the deal. Bobby Hankins was a close friend of Berry Gordy. And that was when you come to visit the Motown Museum in Detroit, it's a little tiny house. The whole thing. It's just a tiny house. So imagine Bobby outside of the tiny house, and on the porch is Berry Gordy saying, okay, girls, go off. Bobby's going to take you to your first show. So the Supremes, before Diana Ross came, jumped in the back bed of his truck, and he was the chauffeur for Berry Gordy, delivering the people from the Motown house to perform. And of course, Bobby fell in love with one of the Supremes, and then later Diana came. But, Bobby was in on music from the get-go. He knew all those people. He was always falling in love. I think, wasn't he in love with Berry Gordy's niece or daughter or something, who lived in a really big house? Berry Gordy, very famous, of course. And then the other one I love is he knew John Lennon very well, and he knew Yoko and John, and he was there when they were when they were killed. He had actually been at the Dakota apartments with them the day before. He was riding around in the limousine with them during the time they were doing that album. But he tells this one story. And he says it was a setup because they were never, ever, the limousine driver never, ever delivered them to the front door of the Dakota, ever, never. But that one time they did? No, it was a setup. Anyway, Yoko Ono was recording for the album, and John hates Yoko's voice so bad that he hid underneath the mixing table, holding his hands over his ears, and told Roy he had to, this was at the record plant, I believe, he had to, just listen to it through his earphones because he couldn't stand it. And Bobby comes in and sees him and he goes, John, what's wrong? What's wrong? He goes, shh, don't tell Yoko. Bobby had stories like this, and you and he have had so much music, so much music deals. So Bobby was always right on the edge with the monastic club. He'd come, he'd listen, he wouldn't talk if sometimes, but he was always there for events. But he had a kind of a different path. But anyway, so there's them, and then there's the guy who painted the picture behind me. You see this picture behind me? This is Howard Weingarten's original of the Egyptian cat goddess. You see the cat goddess, Bastet. And what's really strange is when he showed me this picture, and I'd never seen it before, just before he died, and he was giving me the picture, I'm saying, Howard, this is amazing. This is the goddess Bastet. And he goes, who? Is it the Egyptian goddess of the lion and then of the cat, right? That's what you did here, right? You can't quite see the whole thing. But down at the bottom, there's an elephant, there's Horus, there's an eclipse, there's a camel, there's even a UFO, and in her belt and some other places are hieroglyphs. And so I say to Howard, what do the hieroglyphs mean? And he goes, what hieroglyphs? So we had our friend, I took a picture of it and sent it to Ragadas, who actually studies hieroglyphics, and he sent it back and said it's like a prayer to the goddess Bastet. And Howard didn't know that. That was Howard. He did psychic paintings. He did a psychic painting of me once, but he hung it in his house, and he had to move it to his bedroom, he said, because everyone who saw it would start to cry and say that Jesus Christ was coming through the painting to them. And he was so bored with people doing that in his living room that he moved it to his house. I have that picture in my study now, which he also gave to me. I have quite a few originals. But he also was on the edge of the monastic club. He couldn't keep up with the vicious intellectual conversation of the monastic club in many cases, but he too was clairvoyant. So he and Bobby, if we went to a restaurant, and then you had Robert Thibodeau, who's always giving everybody a reading, and John, who gives people readings, and Brian, who's a reader. And so we had all these readers sitting at a table. We were the absolute worst nightmare of every poor waitress that ever came to a table to wait on us. Plus, it was hard to kick us out. We would stay there forever drinking coffee until Juan Varez, down in Colombia would run out of beans. I'm telling you, it was so exciting. It was so electric in those days. I cannot convey to you how quickly I developed from being a completely reticent kind of person to being completely overt, to the point that the group would call me Goat Boy. Now, if you know what that means, then you can get the laugh. But I admit it, I was like Goat Boy.
I think the probably the appropriate descriptive would be bombastic.
Oh yes, very bombastic, superlatively bombastic.
But just a clarification, because that's a Bast or Bastet in her hand, but that's the cat, a goddess of Egypt. But the lion goddess is Sekhmet. That's a different one. So just to clarify that.
John happens to be an Egyptologist, and he really enjoyed that refinement that he just added to the conversation. Yeah, one of the best, a library that has anything in it that money can buy. That's what you took care of, and you put into that incredible indexing of a great Egyptian library. But yes, Howard didn't know these things. He was channeling.
No. Yeah.
He had no idea. And so I was always going over to his house because I loved Howard. Howard wrote little short stories, and he was just the sweetest guy. Oh my gosh, I loved Howie. Again, I introduced him to his wife, but he probably regretted that after a while. But anyway, I was very dear friends with Howie. And in the end, I hired him to work at one of my schools, and he became the best art teacher I ever had in my life. He was not trained as a teacher in any sense of the word. He could connect with these students, and they would do art that we would win every competition we put art into, literally. And these were students in prisons who had had literally sensory deprivation most of their life. Howard turned them into literally, some of my guys from that particular prison, I had many, schools, 24 of them. That was one of them with lockup situation. Full scholarships to the University of Michigan based solely on the art that Howard had them do in their portfolio.
Yeah, he was so gifted, and he was I really had been a theosophist for a long time, and also studied the Bailey material and all of that, and became introduced to Rudolf Steiner really through association with us. And it's fascinating because, yes, he was so creative. He would paint his paintings, and he'd either be listening to classical music or jazz. And he really knew a lot about jazz. Actually, he was a good jazz drummer. People don't know that. And but Bobby, to blow over these stories so quickly, because there's so many different avenues that can be broken down. But yeah, I remember Bobby and I had a production company. We'd record with Roy Sakala, who started the Record Plant Studio. He was the owner of it and one of the original people that started it out. But he used to be the engineer with Shelley Yakis for the Four Seasons. That's where he came out of. So he goes way back, and he had these ears. He was Sicilian, and he had ears that looked like they were designed by Bose Speaker Company. He had the best ears of anybody. But he would do sessions with us here in Detroit. We'd go over to Pearl Sound, Ben Gross's studio, because it had a Neve board. And Rupert Neve was friends with Roy, and Rupert was famous amongst all engineers at the time because he had the best analog recording boards, and that's what you had installed at the record plant. You also had a SSL a digital, in case some producer came in and that was what he liked to drive. But Rupert Neve would he'd develop a new board, and he'd have it shipped to Roy, and Roy would take it totally apart and reassemble it, and it would be better. And he'd send it back to Rupert Neve, and he'd tell Rupert, and Rupert said, "It sounds cool. What did you do? Figure it out." He wouldn't tell him what he did. Rupert had to figure out what Roy changed.
And Bobby was such a good friend with Roy. He talked to him all the time, right till his death. And I gave him many a reading. I was oftentimes on the phone with Roy talking to him. And sometimes Roy would play his music. And he sought Bobby's advice right up until the end when he moved to Mexico. And Bobby
he was in Brazil, you mean?
I'm in Brazil. Sorry. Yeah, South Africa.
His
South
wife
Africa.
was Brazilian.
That's right. And so he'd call up Bobby and ask him for his opinion on these things, because Bobby had an ear for music that was really very, very, very good. But his connection to Motown and his connection to all of these people was just amazing. And he was always, meeting new people too. And so he was on the outside of the Monastic Club a little bit, but he was, also a participant in the Romantic Futurists and all the other activities that we did. But he wasn't what we call a studied anthroposophist. There's two types of anthroposophists: cosmologists and those who want to have a religious experience. Now, I'm breaking this down pretty basic, but that's, there's cosmologists like John and I. We will argue about whether the eighth sphere had was implanting things from the Archai rebellion in old Saturn until the moon comes up. We can argue these points all day long. Most people couldn't care less about any of this stuff because they're not cosmologists, and that's fine. But they want to have the direct experience of the I am, of the Christ and I am. And that's what drives them. That's what drove Bobby. That's what drove Howard. And Howard was just like a child. Like I could just, so many stories. But we said we were going to talk about two very important women, because these were the women who were in our environment that were also clairvoyant. Both of them, I met Janet McGavin in Kimberton Farms in Pennsylvania. And I had gone there to work because it was a very cool community that took no money from the government and took care of retarded adult people, but special needs, we'll call them. And next to them was Beaver Run, which took care of the most severely damaged children I'd ever seen. And so they worked together. Beaver Run, Kimmerton Farms, and Kimmerton Hills was at the Waldorf School. And the Marin family lived there. It was their farm. They owned Sunoco, Sun Oil Company. They were friends of mine. But anyway, I'm out there and I'm working in the farm, and this lady comes along, and she looks like she's got the aura of a 12-year-old, but she is probably in her 90s. And she's kind of, when she walks, it's like she's dancing, and she's talking to the elemental beings. First time I ever met Janet McGavin. She's talking to the elemental beings, and I'm literally watching this, listening to their conversation, and she's ignoring me like I don't exist. And she's walking up, she's talking to the stinging nettle, and she's, asking them about the rain and about this and that, and is it, she's trying to decide which herbs to collect and which to wait on. And she had always, when you saw her, she had a huge basket on her arm collecting all these herbs, and she knew more about herbs than anybody I knew except Rosina Arndt, who was my biodynamic teacher in Missouri. But anyway, so I immediately fell in love with her, and I'm sitting there, and she looks at me, and she's like, yeah, well, everybody sees the elementals, don't they? So it was no big deal to her. I'm like, holy Lord, I finally found somebody who can talk to the elementals like Rosina did. And I'm so excited. And she's like, it's no big deal. And so so every time she'd go herb gathering, I'd go with her on the farm. And this was a beautiful, fantastic farm. And it was holy. It was sacred. It was biodynamic through and through. And the people who lived there were Camp Hill community members, so they were very Christian, and they knew all about the seasons and about the sun and the planting cycles and all this stuff. Well, strangely enough, the only person like that I've ever quite met, that far advanced, comes to Detroit later. I met her in Pennsylvania. She comes to Detroit, and she becomes one of the major teachers at the Institute. How is it that all the major people come here? Okay, so Janet comes, and she's one of the gray hairs, and she teaches, and it's not like teaching. It's like you're meeting the being of Sophia. Whatever you realize in her presence, you don't give her credit for, because she's not taking any credit for it. She just is. It's just coming because she's living a model life. It's really this. She was one of the most unusual and beautifully and blessed people, but she was a deep, deep anthroposophist. Oh my gosh. But then when she turns from the elemental world to anthroposophy, woo, she was just like a woman, Eve Hardy, and she has passed the threshold now. I taught her son 1st through 5th grade, and she had been with Arnett Coleman. Is that who you said she was with? I always forget these musicians' names.
Ornette Coleman.
Yeah,
she would have. She lived in New York, and she had a place in Greenwich Village with Ornette Coleman, who's like one of the most famous figures in jazz saxophone. And she'd have John Coltrane and Ornette Coleman, and maybe Eric Dolphy jamming in her living room in the middle of the night, and all the neighbors would open their windows, right? I mean, who gets to hear John Coltrane and Ornette Coleman jam in the middle of the night? So she came from a very, very kind of powerful cultural background, and she was such a dynamic person. She had a lectern in her library because she would always read standing up.
And one of her relatives was President Zachary Taylor. I think that's his name. She had the portrait of Taylor in her house, and it was unfinished. And they kept begging her to, please, can we have it so we can put it up at the Capitol? And she wouldn't give it to them. But she was their girlfriend. Okay, God bless you, Eve in heaven. I know you're going to give me hell tonight in my dreams, but she was their girlfriend. She did not mess around. She was at the cutting edge of the cutting edge in the old days, and so she was older than I was. But she was like, oh my gosh, if I did anything wrong, she would rip me to pieces. She would come up in my face and cuss me out. And I'd go, is this actually coming from a woman, or is she a sailor, or what is the deal with her? Here's one of the most spiritual people you'd ever meet, knows anthroposophy backwards and forwards, has studied with one of the great painters, and she studied with all those people. She knew every member of the Vortices. They all knew her. She had inherited a bunch of money at some point, and so she gave money to the institute. She'd give money to anthroposophic interests, and she was known all over the world. And she was a curative painter, so she could help people really get well from just going to her house and painting. But her house itself was a trip.
Yeah, Pat Metheny would come to town. He would have to go to Eve's house. That was on the schedule. It's like she was remarkable, and she had this house in Southfield near the institute, the Waldorf Teacher Training Institute over at Duns Scotus that we talked about in previous episodes. And at this house, she had a biodynamic garden, and in her living room, they had this big picture window, and her backyard was surrounded by a cascade of plant life, such that they were planted there intentionally because certain plants attract certain birds. And you go over there and there'd be like 40, 50 different kinds of birds all twittering away all at the same time. I mean, it was just the most magical place. It was unbelievable, really.
That's true. And she was a parent in my class. So her son came up through my 5 years, 6 years I spent with him. And we used her house for parties and stuff. And she had a swimming pool. But her house was like a jungle. And she planted it. She laid out the whole thing. And the city tried to stop her. And then she would beat them no matter what. She was going to have this magical elemental place. Because she too was into the elementals. But she, focused on painting it towards the end of her life. And so, she was one of the magic ones. Then there was Barbara Glass, Werner Glass's wife. Well, a lot of people had strange responses to Werner because, like myself, he was bombastic. And they would say that he's like a voyeur of history. He would tell you these stories in such dramatic ways because he went through the London School of Dramatic Arts. But he'd tell them in ways that you thought you were a peeping Tom looking through a window into history. And he was odd. He couldn't drive because he couldn't turn his neck from a bike accident when he was young. And he married Barbara, who was one of the top eurythmists, one of the best eurythmists I ever saw. And I knew so many eurythmists. It was ridiculous. And she was a painter too. And she was a saint. She was like the counterpole to Werner, who was like... I don't know a word for Werner. Never met anybody quite like him. And then there's Rosemary Gabert, Hans Gabert's wife. She was a master handscraft person, a weaver. She taught all of us crocheting and knitting and cross stitch and puppetry making and you name it. Anything you can make with your hands. She was an absolute genius that way. So those, and then Theo Bergen, an interesting little German man, was the first grade teacher there when it started. And his wife, Mariana, was a eurythmist. And he was a deep anthroposophist. Holy Lord. When he left, his final words were to the Detroit Waldorf School, which he founded, I only have 3 words for you. Anthroposophy, anthroposophy, anthroposophy. He was a deep, deep, deep student of anthroposophy. And then there was someone else I have to mention, a dear friend of someone we mentioned before, Faith Foster, the great singer, the mezzo-soprano, who was one of my dearest friends, though she was, 30 years older than me. I don't know. But she taught me so many things. But she had a friend who was the top opera singer in the area named Dina Soristi, who later became Dina Winter. She was the secretary of the school. All of these people, the ones I've mentioned here today in the Waldorf School in Detroit, is a background for the fact that it was a tremendous amount of sacrifice on Ralph's part, on the Wilhelm's part, on the Bergen's part, on the Glass's part, on the Gabert's part. They sacrificed. They lived a life of poverty, They were very, very, very humble people. And yet they were teaching the deepest stuff that I could find anywhere in the world. And so the Detroit Waldorf School, magic place, which I've described before, these women really, let's not kid around. The only reason John can be here is because of Barbara. And the only reason I can be here is because of Tyler. That's just a fact. Uh, so without the inspiration of the female, and particularly when you're doing Waldorf or anthroposophy, the female is a key factor. So don't believe that the monastic club was just a boys club. It was much more than that, but we were doing a lot of boys stuff, so it didn't attract a lot of women to that. But we always attracted everybody to our events, and those, as I say, I don't know anywhere to this very day that I've ran across a community that had an outreach like that, and that was at that time when there were literally 200 known anthroposophists in the area. And probably because of John and Robert at the Mayflower, 2,000 people interested in anthroposophy. So we had it was huge. It was huge. And I'd have to say that's the biggest of anything that ever happened in America in terms of anthroposophy.
Also, keep in mind, Werner Glass, who, as I've mentioned on numerous occasions, was the protege of Walter Johannes Stein, who was one of the young people around Rudolf Steiner. But Werner Glass was head of the Waldorf School out in Hollywood. And in fact, he was the mentor of people like Marilyn Monroe and Jack Palance and all these different people that were studying theater with Michael Chekhov's school there. And Michael Chekhov came in to this country. First school he started was in Connecticut, and then he went out to the West Coast and at school in New York and all of that. But it's a different constellation of people. But one day, Marilyn Monroe calls Werner up because she really wanted to talk to him. And he said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I can't make it. I have to do a lecture tonight." And that was the night she passed away.
Yes, Werner knew everyone in Hollywood, because in Hollywood, you certainly sent your child to the Waldorf school because it was the best school in Hollywood. And Werner was there, as so was Virginia Cease, who later became one of the members of the executive committee for the Anthroposophical Society in Dornach, Switzerland. She was a very, very dear friend of her. Best friend was Dina Winter, Dina Saristi Winter. So the best English-speaking anthroposophist in the world at that time would come visit here in Detroit on a regular basis and end up in our first-class meetings, end up in our study groups, end up hanging out. I'd end up hanging out at their house talking with Virginia Cease, who, of course, later would include Sergei Prokofiev with that group. And so we got to have private conversations at Dina's house with some just amazing people, because Dina was the first-class reader. So, these people, they were, in my book, more profound than I'd say almost everyone I met in the Catholic Church. Did I really say that? Oops, because I met cardinals and I met bishops and I met, the big muckamucks no, you want to talk about holy, humble people doing their work. And it centered around these islands of culture, as Rudolf Steiner called them. It's centered around Waldorf schools. So when it came back down to it, the Detroit Waldorf School technically was founded by Ralph Marinelli, who I considered the heart. And most people didn't take him seriously at all. And that's what happens with the jester, who's the wisest one, the only one who gets to tell the king the truth. That's what happens with the clown, who's actually communicating profound things to you. So he was all the time laughing. I remember one time he was defending me because I had done something stupid, probably, at school. And we were in the very reverent, devotional College of Teachers meeting. Ooh. And they were blaming me for something. And I'm just sitting there going, I'm not going to defend myself because I didn't do anything like that. Why would I can't prove what didn't happen. And so Ralph takes off his shoe and starts beating on the table. Bam, 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 screaming at them. He didn't do it. He didn't do it. And he's screaming in the face of this woman who was blaming me of doing something that never happened. I didn't even know it happened, let alone that me doing it. and he's screaming at this woman, and she says, "It doesn't matter whether he did it or not. We're still going to blame him." And then everybody in the circle is going, "Yes." And Ralph just goes, "That's it. I'm done. I help." He's thinking to himself, "I founded this school, and I'm amongst their best teachers, and they're all nuts." And so, unfortunately, many of the anthroposophic communities have gone away from Steiner, gone away from anthroposophy, what Theo Bergen told them. Anthroposophy, anthroposophy, anthroposophy. They went away from Rudolf Steiner. And Rudolf Steiner said one of the worst things that would happen to him in the future is that they would divorce his name from his work. And this has happened. They don't want anything to do with Rudolf Steiner in some Waldorf schools now.
Yeah, I remember, when you and Eve brought me in to teach a history course, and I did world history and American history and all of that. But there was this teacher that at the back of the classroom, there was this big picture of Rudolf Steiner, and she took it down because she said, "Well, he keeps looking at me." Well, I said, "It's a picture, But yeah, it's an intimidating challenge when one meets the work of Rudolf Steiner, because it requires a simple thing that Rudolf Steiner had indicated. He said, healthy suspension of disbelief. And it's amazing how many people are incapable because of the type of education that they've had, that they have this bubble in which they live in, that's their conceptual bubble, that's basically constructed out of a matrix of fear. And so, that being said, well, we've come to the end of another fascinating episode, and we still have only scratched the surface. I want to thank the ingenious work of Tyler Gabriel for coming up with this idea. And of course, I want to thank Douglas for being so forthcoming. I'm learning things from a person that I've known for some 50 years or something like that. So that's, to me, is very special. And it's very special that people are going to enjoy this for years to come. Thank you very much.